Welcome. Welcome to today's webinar. We're here for the launch event of ALNAP's newest publication, an evidence synthesis on the HDP Nexus. In the event today, we will examine progress made on HDP Nexus initiatives, learning to date, and key barriers, including how to overcome these. We have an exciting lineup of distinguished panelists who will also be sharing their views and reflections. Before we start, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Susanna Morrison-Matois, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at ALNAP. So now I'm just going to go over a few points of digital housekeeping. The event today is in Zoom webinar. You'll be able to use the chat function during the event. We'll also have the Q&A function open. This means that audience members can use the Q&A function in Zoom in order to ask questions to the panelists. Please put all questions that you have for the panelist into the Q&A function, not into the chat function. You can also upvote other people's questions as well. Next slide, please. So for today's session, we're going to start with some opening remarks from Ambassador Hessam Youssef. After that, we'll go with a presentation of the findings of our most recent paper. And then finally, we'll go to a panel discussion. The panel discussion will last approximately 60 minutes, and we're going to have some really great speakers sharing different perspectives on the HDP Nexus from the humanitarian and the development side. Next slide, please. So I would now like to present our next speaker, Ambassador Hessam Youssef. He's a Senior Research Fellow at the United States Institutes of Peace and also the chair of the ALNAP Steering Committee. Hessam, can you please start us off with some opening remarks?
Well, let me start by thanking you, Susanna, and the ALNAP team for convening this important event, and thank the great lineup of speakers that we have today and those participating in the event. I was fortunate to have worked throughout my career in the three areas: the humanitarian, development, and peace. And this was done in various capacities and from different perspectives. However, breaking the silos has become an objective only recently. But I have noticed that this was a more focused demand and was more seriously considered in the humanitarian system as compared to the development and peace-building domains. There has been more effort both in the humanitarian and development domains as compared to the peace domain that I am currently focusing on in my works today. It is also recognized that the three domains are facing huge structural crises. First, the failure in conflict resolution globally is catastrophic. It is evident, particularly in the region that I am coming from, the Middle East, perhaps more than in any other region. And this is the case, as we can see, in the war on Gaza, the ongoing conflicts in Syria, Yemen, Libya, Sudan, and beyond the region in the war on Ukraine, conflicts in Myanmar, in the Sahel region, and more. Secondly, on the development front, the vast majority of developing countries are yet to recover from the repercussions of COVID. And we haven't seen success stories in development as we have seen in past decades when we witnessed the East Asian miracle at the time a few decades ago. Thirdly, the failure in conflict resolution and the huge developmental challenges are putting huge pressures on the humanitarian system that is also struggling with growing challenges of its own. The humanitarian system witnessed modest improvements, but are nowhere near the necessary change that is required to face the current challenges at the humanitarian front. But despite these fundamental challenges facing the three domains, breaking the silos remain crucial, and more effort is needed on conflict resolution, perhaps more than in any other domain. Just let us imagine together what the world would have looked like had we been able to prevent or resolve the conflicts in Syria, Myanmar, Ukraine, to name but a few examples. I would like to conclude by 2 points. The first point is that I believe that we need to think about whether we have adequate and effective platforms to address the dialogue and cooperation that is needed amongst experts and officials working in the three domains. And if not, as I believe is the case, what kind of platforms do we need to address these issues and to break the silos between the three domains? Finally, I think we should also focus on learning and gathering evidence, which is of paramount importance, including how practices have changed, what progress has been achieved, what are the obstacles, and how they can be confronted. I hope that our discussion today would allow us to achieve some progress towards these objectives and towards breaking the silos. And thank you very much for convening this important event.
Great, next slide, please. As I said earlier, today is the launch of ALNAP's newest publication, an evidence synthesis on the HDP Nexus. In my presentation, since we don't have a lot of time to hear about all of the findings in the paper, I will just focus on providing a quick snapshot of how the HDP Nexus as a reform initiative has performed, and will conclude by highlighting key areas that need to be addressed going forward. I'm going to cover 4 main areas. First, the motivations for the Nexus in the context of humanitarian action today. Second, the evidence base. Third, I'll share 6 key findings from our research. And finally, I'll wrap up with a few priority areas that need to be addressed for more significant progress. Next slide, please. The case for the Nexus can be summed up in 2 slides. The first is about how the rise in the number of people in need. There has been a dramatic increase in protracted crises in the last decade, driven primarily by conflict. So the case for the Nexus can be summed up in 2 slides. The first is the rise of people in need. There has been a dramatic increase in protracted crises in the last decade, driven primarily by conflict. As the image shows, there's been an 88% increase in the number of people in need. But even more worrisome, this rises to 150% increase if we look at this year's figures, and that was before the current conflict in Gaza. This manifests itself in huge financial and operational pressure for the system. Humanitarian funding has more than quadrupled over the past decade, but it has failed to keep pace with the 5-fold rise in needs. We're now going to look at the evidence base on the Nexus. The findings I'm presenting on today come from ALNAP's evaluation synthesis study. This paper is based on a review of over 600 evaluations, after which 90 evaluations from 27 actors were retained. The research found a large number of evaluations on humanitarian development linkages, but few evaluations that integrate peace. A majority of the evaluations were undertaken by UN agencies or bilateral donors, with relatively few evaluations by NGOs or other actors. So now that we know about the case for the Nexus and the evidence base, I'm now going to present 6 key findings. So if I want to sum up Nexus progress, I can do that on 1 slide. What our research suggests is that there has been significant progress on Nexus policy commitments following the OECD DAC recommendation. But there have been a variety of different approaches to Nexus implementation, and there's also quite a bit of confusion. Moreover, a majority of Nexus practitioners said progress on the Nexus was only fair or poor. And much of this is caused by barriers posed by the fragmented and siloed funding architecture. I'm now going to unpack that snapshot of Nexus progress through the presentation of 6 key findings. So the first question that we asked in the research was, is there a common understanding of the Nexus? Now, what we quickly found is no. There is not a common definition of the Nexus. In fact, there's a very wide variety of ways different actors describe Nexus approaches. Related to this, there's often a lack of theories of change tied to Nexus approaches, resulting in a lack of clarity on what outcomes are expected and how they might be achieved. Evaluations also often highlight the need to ensure that staff are fit for fragility or trilingual and able to work across the H, the D, and the P. There have also been calls for more operational guidance. Evaluations suggest that organizations need to more clearly define what the Nexus means in relation to their specific mandates. And Nexus thinking needs to be further integrated into existing tools, analytical frameworks, and policy principles. Next slide, please. Now, if we focus more on organizational progress, then there are significant steps being taken by key actors. In particular, many multi-mandate organizations are working on their internal silos. We can also see major investments made in staff's capacities to support Nexus work, such as the creation of Nexus advisor posts, both in HQs and at the country level. The UN DAC-supported Nexus Academy is also working now to build the trilingualism necessary to bridge silos. But overall, donor progress is mixed. When the OECD undertook its midterm review of progress on the HDP Nexus recommendation, at the time, over half of donors reported feeling stuck in their institutional silos. And this is also clearly reflected in the evaluation evidence. Now, some of the blame for all of this can be attributed to the siloed approach to funding in conflict and crisis settings. What we can clearly see is that in general, funding remains fragmented and siloed. While there are a variety of new financing facilities, partnerships, and trust funds, including those of the World Bank, the EU, and others, many traditional funding mechanisms have yet to catch up. This is often a problem related both to the quality and the quantity of funding. Looking at extremely fragile contexts, humanitarian aid often outstrips development assistance, and indeed it's more than doubled as a share of ODA in many contexts. Returning to the earlier points about the confusion on what the Nexus is, the introduction of peace into the Nexus has proven challenging for many humanitarian actors. At times, it's been viewed as a social cohesion add-on, or at worst, as a dangerous threat to principled humanitarian action. More worryingly, evaluations show a lack of focus on conflict sensitivity and do no harm in many Nexus approaches, which could be considered the minimalist approach to peace. Related in many ways to the challenges with peace, the sector is also still struggling with how to provide assistance in problematic state contexts. These are contexts such as Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover or in Mali. There are strong concerns about humanitarian principles and what happens when you mix humanitarian assistance with an emphasis on security, stability, and foreign policy objectives. For instance, we have heard recent appeals for taking a no guns in the Nexus approach. Overall, evaluations suggest that much more work is needed to demonstrate how a Nexus approach can lead to better long-term engagement in some of these problematic state contexts. Our last finding is on coordination. What we have found is that it is often at the country level that Nexus initiatives and coordination becomes more tangible. Organizations are increasingly coming together at country level for the development of collective outcomes. In a few countries, including DRC, we have started to see these coordination structures generate active pilots, although in many cases they appear to be largely ad hoc approaches to coordination. However, evaluation evidence finds that many Nexus coordination efforts remain led by humanitarians, with only patchy engagement from development and peace actors. There's also concern about the sheer number of coordination structures and questions about how duplicative they may be and how well they can include and integrate local actors. So let's take a step back and ask, what is the Nexus achieving? The Nexus is often related to the notion of collective outcomes that all actors can contribute to, but only 21 evaluations that we looked at mention collective outcomes. Only 10 describe them in detail or how they're trying to meet them, and none of the evaluations focus on outcomes for affected populations. Some also raise the concern that collective outcomes create new and parallel processes. What this means also is that to date, we have seen no evidence that a Nexus approach is leading to better outcomes beyond the individual project level. I'm now going to sum up by talking just about 2 priority issues that need to be addressed going forward for further Nexus progress. The first is working on bottom-up approaches to the Nexus, including putting a greater focus on localization and gender. Now, some people argue that the HDP Nexus is a solution to a problem that the international system created. Local and national actors often don't define themselves as humanitarian or development actors. One recent evaluation called local actors a Nexus glue. Despite this, localization and Nexus debates are often happening in parallel to one another. A great deal of Nexus coordination is being led by UN agencies and international organizations, and some have described this approach as being top-down. Only 4% of evaluations reflect local or national leadership, and only 2 mention community ownership in Nexus approaches. There is strong evidence from evaluations as well that gender is not being regularly mainstreamed into Nexus approaches, processes, or collective outcomes. This begs the question, what would a locally led, gender-sensitive approach to the Nexus look like? Can we imagine a more bottom-up approach to the Nexus? Finally, the second priority issue is climate. The humanitarian sector is increasingly seeking to address climate risk and resilience, with more work on anticipation. Yet surprisingly, climate is largely missing in Nexus approaches. This lack of attention to climate and the environment has been previously pointed out and is not new. This begs the question, should the HDP Nexus become the HDPC Nexus? If so, which actors are well placed to lead on integrating climate into Nexus approaches? So just to conclude with some reflections on what is the ultimate aim of the Nexus? Where is it going and will it achieve its aims? The answer to this question depends on what your view is on the main purpose of the HDP Nexus as a concept. If you see the Nexus as meant to break self-imposed institutional silos, then progress to date is mixed. If you see the Nexus as being meant to reduce humanitarian needs, this is clearly not happening, and humanitarian needs are continually rising. If the purpose of the Nexus is to address root causes, there's clearly not evidence for this, and only a handful of evaluations even mention root causes. However, if the purpose of the Nexus is to help improve coordination of all actors at country level, then we do see good progress and reason for hope and optimism going forward. But ultimately, progress depends on what we mean and what goals we aim to reach with the Nexus. Is the Nexus meant to be a transformative agenda or a process of incremental change? At the moment, we are seeing some change, but in general, it's not enough. So with that, now that you've heard some of the main findings and views from our most recent paper, we're going to go to the panel portion of the event to get some reactions and reflections on learning and progress from a range of very distinguished policy experts. I'm going to go first to Ambassador Michael Kohler, who is the Deputy Director General for European Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Operations in the European Commission's DG ECHO, where he coordinates worldwide EU humanitarian aid activities. He has 36 years of professional experience in international cooperation, aid, and foreign policy. So Michael, the first question to you is, from your experience as Deputy Secretary General at DG ECHO, what do you see as the main challenge in terms of connecting humanitarian development and peace efforts? How can we overcome these silos? And more particularly, where are we not making progress? Michael, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Susanna. I hope you hear me well. First, congratulations really on this study to ALNAP. And I have to say, whereas perhaps some of the findings from my perspective are more relevant than others, I totally agree with all of them, actually. And the question really is, why is the Nexus so complex? Why is it so complicated? Sometimes in my public presentations, I jokingly say Nexus is nothing else than the Latin translation of the English term common sense. So if common sense is so complex, what is the problem? Because people are not stupid. If something easy and simple becomes complex, it means that there must be interests, so to say, that somehow are served by the complexity. And that is, I think, something we have to look at. Now, I think in your study and with your recommendations, you present already partly the answers to your own question. What we see is that basically, and exceptions confirm the rule, is that we have more fragility in the world, and we have kind of an outsourcing of fragile situations from the development to the humanitarians. However, the humanitarians, in reality, have not innovated over the past 20 or 30 years. We do more, but we do it basically with the same instruments that we already had 20, 30, 40 years ago. So today, in 80% of the cases, we intervene in long-term protracted crises, but we still use the instruments that we use to respond to onset disasters, an earthquake, a tsunami, or a big fire or a drought. In reality, when we go to Afghanistan, to Sudan, to Yemen, to Syria, to Venezuela, and so forth, we are dealing with protracted, very often man-made crisis situations, but we don't use instruments that are made for that. And then we have a different focus from development people. And I speak as somebody who has spent most of his professional life, 36 years you counted, in development, not in humanitarian aid. When you're a humanitarian, you are people-focused. When you are in development aid, you are not people-focused. You're focused on systems. You want to bring about systemic improvements. Your interlocutor is not the individual person that wants to develop, but, for example, governments. Sometimes it's local government, not only the national government. But you have different interlocutors, different mechanisms, and different programming, not only horizons, but also instruments. So the problem really is that as long as this is the case, I don't really see a lot of progress that we could make. Now, in the grand bargain, you referred to my responsibilities there. We of course try to address this. We try to become better. We try, for example, to improve the self-reporting mechanisms on Nexus, so that we speak, let's say, more of a common language between humanitarians and development people, that we have better and more accurate indicators and so forth. Secondly, we collect good practices. There's a lack of good practice in the Nexus world. And honestly, I also would like to have a discussion in spring 2024, so in a couple of months from now, between some key decision makers on the humanitarian side and on the development side, to really discuss why does the Nexus not work? Why basically is this obvious thing not working? And the answer basically lies in the question. If we don't create programming mechanisms and also financial instruments that focus on the needs of people, then frankly, we will never get there. Then the best reporting requirements, the best alliances, the best coordination mechanisms, finding a common language, all the things that you recommend in your report, in my view, don't really work. And there, localization comes into the picture. If we don't work more with beneficiaries and with local responders, then obviously this people focus, the focus on the problem really, will never take center stage. we will rather follow the logic of our silos. I am being paid by EU humanitarian aid. So I have a certain way of dealing with my silo and staying in the silo. Other people are paid by, development funds or by climate funds, and they have to follow the rules of their silo. So there's no bonus if we supersede that. Just to finish, I think the one low-hanging fruit will be indeed disaster prevention. You mentioned climate and climate finance. I don't think we need to have a quadruple nexus, but we need to have areas where the various components of the nexus see a lot of commonality. And disaster prevention in times where everybody has to dedicate a certain percentage, a very high percentage of his or her funding to climate adaptation and mitigation, for me, is an area where the nexus could work relatively well.
Okay, great. Thank you. No, I think we'll have to be watching really closely what the Grand Bargain is doing on the nexus going forward, also in terms of establishing indicators and progress, and having that discussion, I think that you mentioned in next year of, why is this not working? How are we going to really overcome these silos? Let me now go to our next speaker, and if there's time, Ambassador, we'll come back to you again at the end, and if there's any audience questions. Our next speaker is Lene Kroge, who is a humanitarian advisor based in NRC's, the Norwegian Refugee Council's team in Geneva, and she recently conducted in-depth research examining Nexus approaches in 5 case study countries, and she's standing in for a colleague who wasn't able to make it, but was the lead author of the Norwegian Refugee Council's research on this topic. So Lene, my question for you is, I know that you have recently done research on how the HDP Nexus has been operationalized in specific country contexts. What have you found in terms of what's working and what is not working? And also, how does this maybe align with ALNAP's findings? Lene, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susanna, for including NRC in this webinar. I also, like Michael, would like to start by thanking you and congratulating you on this research piece that you've been doing. I find it extremely timely, and gives some very interesting global perspectives on what has been achieved today, and what some of the main barriers and challenges remain that should be addressed. So as you rightly say, we at NRC, we launched an outcome report for some research we did on the Nexus in 5 case study contexts. We looked at Iraq and Libya, where we examined the transition that they've gone through at a country level from a humanitarian response to a Nexus or durable solutions response. Then we looked at Cameroon, where they've had a very localized bottom-up approach to the Nexus, focusing on 2 convergence areas in the country. And then lastly, we looked at Somalia and Afghanistan, which are 2 contexts where the Nexus has not really gained footing, but where we examined the consequences of this over-reliance on humanitarian assistance without sufficient complementary investments into longer-term outcomes and solutions. With NRC's in-depth case studies and ALNAP's more global perspective, I think there's a lot of very complementary findings, and it's quite encouraging for me to see that we have identified many of the same barriers and challenges, but also opportunities to how to advance the Nexus. So let me just highlight a few of the findings from our research, which I think echo very well ALNAP's findings. So like ALNAP, we found that the current siloed coordination system is not necessarily fit for purpose and does not incentivize coherence across the HDP pillars. We also very much highlighted a gray zone between this life-saving humanitarian emergency assistance and the longer-term, more traditional development cooperation. And this is especially the case in protracted crisis context. We know that people that are affected by protracted displacement in contexts like Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, they do not want to remain dependent on short-term humanitarian assistance. They want to become self-reliant, and they want a durable solution. And so this calls for investments into longer-term outcomes in complementarity to principled humanitarian assistance. And this raises the question, how are these gray zone interventions best coordinated and financed, which to me speaks very well to the ongoing system reform and how we make the current system more fit for purpose for protracted crisis contexts. Another finding is, like ALNAP, that we are finding financing really to be a main barrier to advancing the Nexus. In all the 5 case study contexts that we examined, we found that donors had taken quite a few steps to live up to their commitments under the OECD DAC recommendations, and it appears that donors have some challenges in making the needed changes at scale to advance the Nexus. For example, in all the contexts I examined, there was a lack of long-term flexible and predictable funding made available, despite the policy commitments on this. We also found a general lack of coherence between financing for humanitarian interventions and development investments in the country. So some countries only relied on one or predominantly relied on one of those financing flows. And when both were available, it seemed that there was a lack of geographical targeting and people targeting that would create such an overlap, so that would be a space for collaboration. And lastly, we saw that there was a general lack of any kind of coordination between development and humanitarian donors at country level. And when there was, they were very difficult to deviate from pre-established priorities to really collaborate around common objectives. Therefore, NRC's research includes some strong recommendations for donors and IFIs to use financing as an accelerator for the Nexus. And part of that could, for example, be to move away from the state building approach to development, where you absolutely need a strong government to be the counterpart for the intervention, and move to a more people-centered approach where we target the most vulnerable, also in order to not leave anyone behind, which will require an increased risk appetite and political will on the side of the donors and IFIs. And lastly, just a very on the top mentioning, we also found that there was a lack of inclusion of local actors in a lot of these country-level Nexus approaches, which is really a missed opportunity to ensure local leadership advances, and something we also feel should be addressed. I'll leave it here, Susanna, and happy to elaborate in any follow-up questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, no, when your report came out, I was struck by just how similar so many of the findings were. And I think, we took very different approaches in the research, where we looked at evaluations and you did, these in-depth case studies, and we didn't do case studies. So I guess it's a bit reassuring on the one hand that these 2 very different research came up with very similar conclusions. And you mentioned quite a bit on financing and donors and what they can do. So I'm now going to we'll see if there's any questions for you from the audience if we have time at the end, but I'm going to now go to our next speaker, who is Cyprien Fabre. So he leads the Crisis, Conflict, and Fragility Unit at the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate. He has a humanitarian background and was deployed with the European Commission in various conflict areas worldwide between 2003 and 2015. He also leads, I think, and works with the INCAF network of donors, and has, I think, a lot of experience looking at donor financing issues. So Cyprien, I think the first question following on Lene's remarks that I want to ask you is, what do you see as the largest barrier to progress on the Nexus? And is it donor funding, as some evaluations suggest? And if so, what can be done to address this? If you can speak to the biggest barrier, and is it actually donor funding, and how do we get over that hurdle if it is one? Cyprien, over to you.
Thank you, Susanna. And it's all about donors. It's all donors' fault, as everybody knows. No, first, thank you for organizing the event. It's of course very timely, and even for us, because we know that the Nexus is important for us. The DAC recommendation on the HDP Nexus is reaching its 5 years anniversary. So we are completing now the monitoring report of this implementation amongst donors, amongst adherents, DAC members, and the UN adherents to the recommendation. And so some of the findings are exactly the same. Of course, it makes sense, and indeed it's reassuring. I think that we need to focus on the fact that for us, initially, the HDP Nexus was about more coherence and more complementarity amongst different actors engaging in crisis or in fragile contexts. It was not about breaking silos, and I mean, silos or technical expertise was created for a reason. So it's not about, you know, if you have a tree cycle, it's not about merging all the wheels in a big, large, wide wheel. It's about make sure that all the wheels are going into the same direction, and you have mechanisms to have a link between those wheels. It's just a little analogy, but to give you the sense that it's not about putting everything together. Yet, of course, we've seen we've seen a lot of progress, definitely, and of course, it's not surprising. Progress was made, but challenges remain. We have all that in our reports, and it's the same here. The progress, the Nexus approach, the need for complementarity is clear for all DAC members, for all adherents. Also, the need to be more conflict sensitive, and it's important because at the core of the Nexus approach, and this is for us the meaning of the peace part of the Nexus, is peace as the objective, meaning conflict prevention. It goes from conflict preventions up to do no harm and conflict sensitivity in development approach. I think that in terms of obstacles, the one I see is certainly the way we look at crisis collectively. So it's not about, you know, in our development or humanitarian circles, it's broader. It's at the media, the politicians, the policy level. We tend to see crisis as a sum of needs to be filled, and to be filled preferably from the outside. So sectoral needs, you need shelter, poof, money to HCR. You need education, path, money to UNICEF, and so forth. So, and we see that, which is good because people need support, and a lot of support, and you've said it more and more, 88% increase is terrible. But if we only look crisis as a sum of technical needs to be filled from the outside, we miss a lot. And the Nexus for me was the possibility to look at crisis beyond that, as really the fact that an entanglement of economic, of political dynamics where external support, donors, but donors in their donor capacity, but also in their political, diplomatic capacity, can support a country overcoming its crisis time. Even if we don't like the government, if we don't like the junta, the Taliban, there are things to be done beyond only humanitarian aid or supporting the most vulnerable. It's complicated though, because in the same time we've designed the system in a way that in the most complicated context, you have, for instance, sanction regimes which prevent you to do really some development or even to have a political discussion, let alone a development discussion with the local governments. So there is a tendency to resort to humanitarian aid as not the last resort, but the very first resort, the sort of the de facto crisis response instrument for everyone in any cases. And I really joined what Ambassador Michael Collard said earlier. The humanitarian has grown in scope, but not is not fit for its new task. And you have this tension with what is principled, what is not. But if we keep humanitarian being role in such a way that first you only focus on the most vulnerable, and the most vulnerable, they need to be supported, but they are not the only one impacted, and you cannot support the transformational effect that is needed to support a country going through its crisis time. So I'll stop here, but it's really what I see from a distance. The way we look at crisis is certainly an obstacle to a better coherence and complementarity, and to hold the difficulties we face into responding to crisis. Thank you.
Great. No, yeah, we're definitely looking forward to the 5-year review of the OECD DAC recommendation coming out in 2024. and getting more insights from that, I think, in terms of also all of the donors and UN agencies and others that have signed up to it, have they been accountable for actually making those changes? That was one of the things that came up quite a bit is there a clear accountability framework? Are there indicators? We saw some development cooperation organizations like Switzerland making major overhauls. And we have some donors, you know, like CEDA, Sweden and Ireland, who are doing lots of really good things on the finance side. Then we see others who just aren't doing that. And so there's this uneven progress, right? And so it's, how do you actually incentivize change then? You know, I don't know if that's a process of naming or shaming, but if you adhere to this commitment, I think it's fair to ask, what are the changes that you've actually been making? If it's complementarity, if it's better funding, what does that look like? I just wanted to ask you one quick follow-up question, because you did mention the peace aspect. So this is something that I've never quite fully understood. When peace was added to the Nexus by the OECD as the peace, what did you mean by the peace pillar? Because the thing that we found is it means so many different things, right, to different people. We have this idea of big P versus little p, which the IESC has been promoting. We have some people who say no guns. We have other people that say actually security sector reform and state building. And so it seems a little bit all over the place. But then when we actually look at what organizations, and this includes a lot of the UN ones, are evaluating as their HDP Nexus, there's almost no mention of peace. And they were trying to use the evaluations to actually figure out sometimes what peace means to them. And I think you've also had some paper recently that looked at ODA for peace, if I'm not mistaken. And my understanding is ODA for peace has maybe actually gone down. We're not spending money on peace. So what is happening with the peace part of the Nexus? It just seems a little bit missing sometimes, but I've never, the more research I've done, the less I've understood what it's meant to be, which is, I don't know if that's a problem that I have or that other people are also struggling with. Yeah, can you just say a few words about that? What does it mean for the OECD, really?
Yeah, no, thank you. And you're right, it's complicated because it has been at the beginning, and the Nexus approach is broader than just the DAC recommendation, of course. But for us is how your ODA and your action as a donor, as adherence to the recommendation, support peace objectives. So it can be peace as a sector, and we have at the OECD the 18 sector codes. You know, when you report your ODA, you have to report what it is. Is it humanitarian aid? Is it support to demining? Is it support to human rights? Or is it road? Is it whatever? So we have 18 sector codes who we believe support peace objectives. And we've just published something which is peace and ODA, which we made just to clarify what we meant by what is peace in the HDP Nexus. So you see, whatever contributes to peace and conflict prevention is part of that. And you're right to say that. Whereas everybody would say that conflict prevention is super important because the world is terrible and we need to prevent, and $1 in prevention save how many dollars in humanitarian aid. Still, for collectively from the DAC from the DAC side, we are very low. We are at the 5 years lowest records at global aggregate level on peace. So there is a mismatch here that we need to explore further. Why is it so? Why humanitarian aid ODA expands for every year? Because of course we have more needs, and because humanitarian aid is the sort of first line resort, but also there is something to probably to explore a bit more on why peace ODA is so low. But peace for us was really the objective. Peace, conflict prevention, peace building. It can be programs, it can be guns, but it's certainly not guns what we had in mind when we designed the Nexus. Absolutely not. Thanks.
Okay, great. And I know that there's a lot of work by the IESC, including some ALNAP work now with the ISCC, which we'll talk about at the end in terms of actually looking at what peace looks like and what are good practices around that and unpacking that further. So I'm now going to go, thank you, Cyprian, and we'll look forward to the review coming out in 2024 and see how much it aligns with our findings as well in terms of progress. We're now going to go to UNDP, to Corley Pretorius, who is the head of Policy, Knowledge, and Partnerships team in the Crisis Bureau at UNDP. Corley has worked internationally for more than 20 years across diverse institutions to sustainably manage resources and reduce people's exposure to nature-related risks. She has extensive experience in global policy and UN system policies, including 13 years and 3 roles at UNEP, the UN Environmental Program. So Corley, my question to you, to UNDP, is our work highlights how staff and organizations need a wide variety of skill sets and tools related to HDP approaches and ways of working. I know that UNDP has been working on building staff capacity through its work with the Nexus Academy. Can you tell us a bit about this, and what do you see as the largest skill gap that staff are missing? So staff and organizations, because that came up just repeatedly in the evaluations, the staff don't have the right skill sets. So what do you see as the skill gaps, and what are you doing within the Nexus Academy to actually help address those? Corley, over to you.
Thank you very much, Susanna. And if I can just start off by thanking you for hosting this conversation, and also for presenting the findings and bringing us together to reflect on your findings. In terms of UNDP's role on well, first and foremost in fragile and crisis settings, we're there before, during, and after crisis. And it's for us really critical to look at how do we preserve, bank, if you like, the development gains that were achieved in countries. And by doing so, we want to strengthen local and national capacities, because this is the way out of it, out of crisis, out of fragility. From the Nexus Academy point of view, this was formulated by UNDP in 2021 at the behest of the OECD DAC members. And since then, we have trained around 600 people from more than 60 organizations across the Nexus, so across humanitarian development and peace actors, bilateral, multilateral, NGO sectors, but also HQ capacities, regional offices, and colleagues in the field. It's really an external facing, bringing people together. When we look at the sort of implementing the Nexus, if you like, it's often characterized by descriptive terms such as coherence, collaboration, coordination, cooperation. We've been very fortunate in the cohorts that participates in the Nexus Academy, and this might be viewed as maybe a case of self-select also, are very collaborative. They are very interested to work together to formulate that joint action. But they are also challenged, as Ambassador Mueller has referred to, by the system inertia. And I would add to sort of not only the outdated instruments, also the organizational culture that was sort of accompanying the instruments over the last 30 or 40 years. And this is really a challenge to people that they struggle with. It creates a great deal of frustration. But I think beyond the sort of our frustration and our needs to respond to outdated sort of demands and accounting practices, we need to reflect on what are the consequences really on the ground of our inability to adjust, the system's inertia to adjust. So what we are looking at developing, or what we are developing, is this shared recognition around this multiple objectives, multi-criteria approaches. And I know you've put it down as a sort of a criticism, this kind of reduction, but the reduction of saving lives, enabling livelihoods, and creating that social cohesion needs to be part of a shared recognition. We need all the parts, and this is really what we've been aiming to instill through the Nexus Academy. There's another dimension also, of course, that we work with different timeframes and different systems, that was also pointed out. So one way for us to embed this shared understanding is to really emphasize as an organizational approach on joint assessments, understanding the context in the same way, that shared purpose of what are the elements that we as a community need to address, shared analysis, and then maybe not forcing everyone through the same funnel in terms of joint programming, but joined up approaches, that collective sense. The second important part for us is really to focus at the local level, at the community level, at the national level, because it's there where the interaction and the mutual dependency and the lasting sort of impact and sustainability is being created. And that is really I would say, the second important part of enabling and empowering national field level staff to be able to contribute most.
Okay, great. No, thank you. I think some really important points there. And we did have a section, there is a section in the paper looking at kind of joint analysis and some of the tools that have been used for that. And saying, yes, there's very few cases of actual joint programming, but taking kind of this joint analysis, you know, a little bit of joint programming, even less like joint implementation approach, and looking at complementarity even more and making sure that, you know, the actors are kind of filling the right gaps, I suppose, and sharing that information across is very important. And I think it's really refreshing to hear the focus on working with local actors, because it was so absent from the evaluations. I think the thing obviously with evaluations is they're a bit backwards looking. So I'm hoping that there's a lot more emphasis on that now that wasn't fully captured, but that will be going forward. So I just want to then, switching gears a little bit, but going back to another one of the findings that we had in the paper that was a bit surprising to me, was that climate almost never came up in most of the kind of Nexus evaluations. Well, when it did come up, actually, you know, it was often suggested that they could be better integrated into Nexus approaches, particularly around resilience. There's so many sort of overlaps. And, you know, when you look at climate as kind of a risk multiplier, as a cause of conflict, you know, the linkages are clearly there. So I know that UNDP has done some work with Jeff, the Global Environmental Facilities, and others. So the question is, how does UNDP view climate concerns in relation to the HDP Nexus? And do you think the HDP Nexus should be the HDPC Nexus? Is there a reason why we're not integrating climate? You know, if you look at the Horn of Africa, other places, it feels a little bit like we're ignoring something quite major. Or is that just adding more complexity? Or how does UNDP actually see this? Because, yeah, it was surprising to me to really, you know, not see that focus, even though, you know, there's so many, there were a few cases of natural disasters and others where Nexus approaches were applied that were very successful. But it seems that it could be done on a much greater scale. Yeah, so over to you. What are your views on this in terms of climate and the Nexus? If we can't get the Nexus right, could we get it right with climate? Or is there actually something that we really need to integrate into that now? Yeah.
Absolutely. You know, we're speaking at the time when the Conference of the Parties is happening in Dubai. And I think it's safe to say that the world has been dragging its feet in really understanding and responding to the climate crisis. And, you know, the HDP or the humanitarian development actors, we are not immune to being slow to truly understand the impact of climate change. And as you rightly pointed out, it is a massive multiplier of fragility or vulnerability, but it also means that it also is a question that we have opportunities to address that. So from UNDP's side, we really have put a huge emphasis on climate readiness, climate adaptation, climate mitigation. We support 140 countries with their national climate strategies. So it's really a central part of UNDP's rollout. It is true that in crisis context, there needs to be much more of a concerted effort to reduce vulnerability and to build resilience. And I think there we're all missing the opportunities and not really paying attention to the evidence base in terms of complex emergencies and the root causes that are related to natural resources. And, you know, the list is very long in terms of those contexts. So for me, it's a question of looking or approaching this as a part of a risk-informed approach and really understanding what are the exposure, the threats that communities face, whether, you know, they agroeconomy systems, whether it's flooding, whether it's natural hazards, whether it's changes in temperature regimes, what are the risks on the one hand, and on the other hand, what are the coping capacities? Where are the institutions that are going to help people to cope with climate change, with events, with changes in temperature? And that provides, in my view, a unifying entry point for us to act and to really understand and to think about climate risk and really take on a prevention resilience building approach in trying to avert or to reduce the likelihood, soften the impact, and really strengthen the coping capacities. I also want to just give credit to the work of the OECD in terms of the states of fragility, the methodology that they have developed there, in terms of linking to that multi-dimensional view of fragility and crisis settings, because that is really, for me, an analytical framework or an approach that we can all build on and understand the implications for our own organizations, and how do we work together in an HDP Nexus approach to build the resilience against those risks and strengthen the coping capacities, as I've said. Whether it should be a C to add a C to a HDP, I don't think so. I think it needs to be just straightforward, integrated in the same way as gender. Gender responsive approaches should just be integrated. We should not have another silo, another special pillar, another way to do it. This should be part of our collective understanding of what's important, and it should be part of our value system in terms of this is things that we can actively contribute to, whether it's as an international community or whether it's at a national level, local level, to really change the way that we think about the world and that we can build those buffers. Thank you.
Great, thank you. No, I think that's, yeah, brilliant points of, and it was surprising that we were reading these evaluations, but we weren't necessarily seeing climate mainstreamed or integrated, and we definitely weren't seeing gender integrated. You know, despite the focus on feminist foreign policies, despite the women, peace and security agenda. And so you had all of this, you know, information on the Nexus without speaking necessarily about gender. There's a really interesting interagency evaluation that looks specifically at the Nexus and gender, and the findings were a bit sobering. So I think it's a reminder too of, you know, we can term these things whatever we want, but it goes back to good practices actually, and making sure that we are taking holistic approaches. So we'll come back and see if there's any audience questions, but thank you very much. And we're going to turn to our next panelist, who is Xavier Furtado. He is a senior operations officer at the World Bank, covering Somalia, Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda. He had joined the World Bank after a secondment from the Canadian International Development Agency as an economist in the World Bank Institute, and then again in 2010 as the head of the Protection of Basic Services Secretariat in Ethiopia, one of the IDA's largest operations at the time. So in terms of the World Bank, going to you, I know that the World Bank has been increasing its support and work in fragile contexts. And the bank was also involved, going back to the peace issue, in the Pathways to Peace publication in 2018, around the same time that the P got added to the HDP Nexus, this focus on conflict prevention and peace. So there was a call for more efforts on conflict prevention. What can you tell us about the bank's recent progress since that publication came out? Javier, yeah, so going back to the peace, what has the bank been doing in terms of peace and conflict prevention? Have you made a lot of progress and seen a lot of change? Yeah.
Thanks. So first of all, let me join others in thanking you, Susanna, for convening today's conversation. This is very interesting, and I must say I do feel I'm perhaps the least qualified amongst your panelists to comment on these matters. But let me do what we can. First of all, thanks for referencing the Pathways to Peace publication, which was a fantastic joint initiative, as I think everyone here knows, between ourselves and the UN system, and I think really. You know, kudos to my colleagues who worked on it and those at the UN system. It was really a path-breaking piece, and it's an interesting report also because it's not one that simply sat on a shelf. I think, as many of you know, there have been several efforts to reflect on what has or has not worked coming out of the Pathways for Peace publication, including a 5-year retrospective, which some colleagues of mine here in the FCV group just have been concluding earlier this year. I think it's fair to say that since Pathways for Peace, you are correct, Susanna, the bank's done a lot more work, has really scaled up its efforts in fragile states. I think several of the panelists and others in this call will know that in the 19th replenishment of the International Development Association, which is our concessional financing window for low-income countries, starting in July 2020, there was a new envelope created called the FCV envelope, essentially ring-fenced financing within the IDA financing pool for fragile states. And within that financing envelope, eligible countries can potentially access 3 different allocations depending on their needs. One, which I'll come to in more detail, around prevention and resilience. A second allocation around what's called turnaround, if countries are showing progress towards exiting prolonged or protracted situations of conflict, there's an allocation for that. And there's a third allocation, not as frequently used for some of the reasons that other panelists have mentioned, that allows or supports the bank in staying engaged in countries that are in the midst of conflict, but understanding all of the sensitivities and issues that entails. Each of these windows provides the possibility of additional financing beyond a country's normal allocation under IDA. And we've seen, several countries make very good use of this window. As of the end of September of this year, the FCD envelope has dispersed just about, I think, $7.5 billion to approximately 13 countries. Most of which, the far majority of which, are in sub-Saharan Africa. And again, taking advantage of the different allocations depending on their needs. I guess the other point I would raise is that, as several have mentioned, it's not just about financing. And as I see some people have mentioned here in the chat, sometimes the financing is perhaps problematic. In preparation for this panel, you and I, Susanna, were talking about the importance of doing no harm. And so there's also a fair bit of analytical and diagnostic work that the bank has been doing in eligible fragile states. One particular one I would draw attention to are what's called now our risk and resilience assessments, which some of you might be familiar with in different countries. These are diagnostic pieces that are meant to try to uncover what are the underlying drivers of fragility, conflict, and violence, and then allow us, the government, but also interested international partners and local partners to think about how we might reposition our assistance to try to speak to the fragility drivers and maybe to some issues around prevention, coming back to the other part of your question. And I would point out that we're undertaking more and more of these RRAs, risk and resilience assessments, in countries that are not actually on the fragile states list. One example, I can point to is a country like Cote d'Ivoire. Now, many of you know Cote d'Ivoire was for several years on the FCS list, and then it came off because I think there was a consensus that it had made a fair bit of progress coming out of protracted conflict. But we are now in the midst of actually starting to undertake an RRA in Cote d'Ivoire, not because there's a clear and present danger the way there is, let's say, in some neighboring countries like Benin and Togo, but because there are some concerns around what's happening in the Sahel, obviously, and we want to be able to position ourselves and other partners, local and international, to try to help get ahead of the problem by pre-positioning our assistance accordingly. Yeah, I think I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions as the group would like.
Okay, great. No, I think that we're seeing a plethora of different kinds of analysis and tools. I know in the past, the OECD promoted the resilience systems mapping and analysis, so that there's quite a few different options, I suppose, out there for different kind of Nexus actors. I suppose sometimes I wonder, are they all joined up? To what extent could they be more so? But I suppose that's a conversation for another day. I did just want to ask you quickly, I think we have just a few minutes, but because it hasn't come up, one of the findings in the paper, which we didn't present on, was actually also something that was found to be a bit missing in Nexus approaches. and that's engagement with the private sector. Now, this was interesting because in the few evaluations that spoke about the private sector, it was saying the private sector is a really relevant actor here, because you need to build market systems. And so this goes back maybe to Lene's point around people don't want to be reliant on humanitarian aid. People want to have functioning market systems. Humanitarians don't want to be delivering non-food items and food endlessly or crowding out the private sector. The question for you is not even so much what is the bank doing, what could humanitarians be doing to support the private sector? And this seems to be missing from the Nexus approaches of how are we really looking at markets and the resiliency of the markets within these fragile contexts. So that's a tough one, but yeah, in a minute or two, do you have any suggestions for the humanitarians? Because, IFC, the World Bank, you're supposed to be known for kind of working with private sector actors, but humanitarians aren't. So do you have any suggestions for humanitarians in terms of, is there something that we can be doing to promote market approaches in some of these contexts as well?
I am a bit reluctant to sort of suggest what others should or could be doing. So with that qualification, I mean, let me just say, so based on my own experience in the field, at one point I was the head of our office in Sudan, and this was during the time of the comprehensive economic embargo. So actually, making markets work, as my colleagues at IFC like to say, was very, very difficult. But one thing I did notice about the humanitarian actors is that, because of the field-based presence of so many humanitarian actors, they had insights and on-the-ground intelligence that many of us did not have, whether it was me at the World Bank side or my colleagues at IFC. And so I did think there were opportunities, and we tried to make some of these opportunities work in country, where humanitarian actors were seeing things, were seeing risks, but also opportunities that I think private sector actors found very, very interesting. And in the case of Sudan, it wasn't actually much about the international private sector because of the economic embargo. It was more about the Sudanese private sector, largely based in Khartoum, that actually didn't always have a firm grip on what was happening outside of Khartoum, to be honest. So I think there were opportunities for a lot of information sharing, where I think humanitarian actors could play a very useful role. Again, around the issues that matter to humanitarian actors, like food supplies, logistics, local crops that could be used and bought in local markets to feed humanitarian needs. I think there is also maybe an opportunity for humanitarian actors to also perhaps be careful around, as you just mentioned, whether or not donor-funded humanitarian assistance is in fact crowding out some potential local private sector solutions. One famous example I think many of you know about is the production of plumpy nut. Now, plumpy nut is oftentimes imported. It's oftentimes imported and paid for with humanitarian dollars. But there are opportunities either in country or in neighboring countries to produce either plumpy nut or something equivalent that could, again, if humanitarian actors were willing to sort of step aside, then local private sector or regional private sector could come in, which of course is cheaper. It also has the benefit, obviously, of employing people locally and giving them a longer-term solution. I guess the last point I'd make very quickly is that obviously private sector, it's a bigger issue. There's a need sometimes for us to sort of take a step back and look at the policy and enabling environment, which is preventing the private sector from actually operating as effectively as possible. And so there's, I suppose, the need for a much stronger upstream conversation that involves humanitarian actors, people like ourselves from the World Bank Group, but also local actors as well. In fact, local actors, I would say, primarily. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I like the tangible mention of plumpy nut. I remember working in West Africa and seeing people importing plumpy nut and handing it out when you have lots of peanuts on the local market, and it's kind of peanuts and vitamins, and you think the system is a bit nuts. And then South Sudan, we were distributing it and it was being resold for a few cents. So, definitely some issues there. So we're going to go now. Thank you very much. We're going to go now to our final speaker, our final panelist, who is Fatima Imam. She is the founder and executive director of the Rehabilitation, Empowerment, and Better Health Initiative, REBHI, which is an organization that aims to promote and protect women's rights and empower women and girls through livelihood and psychosocial support. She's also the director of the Legal Affairs Network of Civil Society Organizations in Borno State, and Fatima has engaged extensively in humanitarian response in the Northeast region of Nigeria. So Fatima, we're really happy to have you with us today. So I want to talk to you a little bit around, in our paper in ALNAP's review of evaluations, which we've talked about already, there was so little focus on how local actors are engaged in Nexus coordination, not only Nexus coordination, but actually Nexus decision making. So this is despite some evaluations saying local actors need to be in the center, they are the Nexus glue. So obviously our conclusion was, well, maybe we need a more inclusive bottom-up approach to the Nexus at country level. What are your views on this? And can you share your experience from working in Nigeria? Do you see local actors being included in approaches that are being taken in Nigeria? And if not, why and what should be done about this? Fatima?
Thank you very much, Susanna, and good afternoon, colleagues. Yeah, I thank you very much for giving me the space to actually bring forth the voices of local actors. It is indeed a great platform. Yeah, discussions and conversations around the HDP has taken center stage now. Just recently, I think in October, we were in Copenhagen, for this workshop around the humanitarian development peace nexus. And I think there's a lot of other spaces and conversations currently ongoing around the HDP. But I think what still remains to be seen is the inclusion and involvement of local actors from the beginning, and when I mean from the beginning is from the planning and from designing of interventions. For a very long time, local actors are just involved to tick the box, to just ask whether they are at the table or not. And we really need to move beyond that to ensure that they are actually at the table where the voices count the most. So if you're going to look at coordination at the global level as well as at the country level, you would see in Nigeria, for example, where such conversations happen mainly at the global level, but nothing is moving at the country level. In fact, in country, most of these conversations are UN-centric. They are actually driven by the international community, and the voices of local actors are not heard. And that is because in most of the decision-making spaces and coordination spaces that we have in country, the representation of local actors is not encouraging. I would like to give you an example of the HCT, for example, where we have just one local actor, in the presence of probably 7 to 8 international actors. It means that the voice of that local actor is actually lost within that space. So it's not just about being in those spaces and participation, it is about meaningful participation where you are given the time and resources to actually consult and make the best possible use of that space, which is often lacking for a lot of actors. And I think, like I have said, it is important that we are represented in numbers in those decision making spaces, not just within the HCT, but I think another example is also the advisory board of the country-based pool fund that we have in Nigeria, where it has always been one local actor. And then I think through advocacy, we have now 2, hoping to have more local actors, because if you look at the percentage of the international actors vis-a-vis the local actors, then you would see that, when it comes to giving a voice, or sometimes even going to vote on certain decisions, then the local actors would actually be outnumbered. And I think also one very, very important point that we really need to make is that dichotomy, that does exist between the humanitarian development and peace nexus. For local actors, it doesn't exist. Our priority is driven by community needs and community priorities. For me personally, this is a problem that is created by the international community. And what we tend to forget is, in trying to look at these solutions for the HDP, what are we trying to do? We are trying to actually offer support to the community, because we are always supposed to put the communities in the center of our response. But currently, the way we have tailored this and the way we have designed things, it is the other way around. It is centered and designed around the international community and not necessarily around communities. And I think I hear a few speakers talk to the fact that, there are a lot of local initiatives and innovations that we really need to pay attention to. In trying to impose some of these Western ideas, we are unfortunately trying to transform or convert local actors to become international actors. As local actors, we have our own uniqueness. We should be left to remain as local actors, responding to local issues with our local solutions. If I go to my community now, the challenge is what are the issues and how I can be able to address those issues. They do not see me either as a humanitarian actor, as a development actor, and certainly not as a peace actor. Thank you.
Sure, no, great, thank you. That echoes so much, I think, of what I've heard from talking to a number of different also civil society actors in this space. And so I think it's really great, for instance, at that event in Copenhagen that looked at Nexus and the localization took place. It seems like it's a little bit late to really be having the conversation now of, okay, how do you put local actors in the front and center and the heart of the Nexus? And I think, maybe we can go back to, if we have time, Ambassador Michael, on the Grand Bargain, because the Grand Bargain has worked on both localization and the Nexus, and really hear, okay, what are we doing on this going forward? What are the solutions? But I want to ask you another question, and I'm sort of looking at some of the questions in the chat, and there's also, one on gender as well. So one of our findings was that gender was often not integrated into the Nexus projects, and so people are talking about the Nexus, and even in the collective outcomes, when evaluations looked at collective outcomes, there were not collective outcomes around gender. So this was quite surprising, and I know that your organization is women-led and you work to address sexual and gender-based violence. What are your views on this, and what would it take to better integrate gender? Why are people talking a lot? I mean, I hear in policy circles, everyone talks about gender, everyone wants it. In practice, is it really being integrated? Are organizations like yours who are doing the important work on gender-based violence and women's issues, are you getting the funding that you need? Are you being integrated into these conversations? What would it take?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I think the issue is that usually gender is looked only or mostly through the humanitarian lens, and I think addressing that requires not just looking at it, through that lens, but in a more holistic way, because gender includes issues around justice or access to justice or legal services. It includes economic empowerment, it includes change in attitudes and beliefs, norms, etc. So until we're able to focus on that and be able to come together to address these issues holistically, then I think we would continue to have some of these issues, because I think there's that realization that, of course, gender issues take longer, to address, because we're talking about the root causes, of these gender issues. We also require flexible multi-year funding to address some of these issues that we have just mentioned. So, and again, I think in the response, we tend to focus more on Western approaches, emphasizing more on case management, clinical management of rape, for example, instead of looking at more contextual approaches, focusing on longer term rather than just emergency. Putting band-aid on some of these issues will not necessarily give us what we want. So if we want to really make, prioritize gender, we have to look at the holistic approach where all actors would come together and work together in a holistic way. Continue to work in a longer term, this short term 3 months, 6 months projects in gender-based violence projects will not really give us what we desire. So I think it is most important that we look at it and ensure that that is actually prioritized. I see that there are no questions to me probably on peace building, but I think because of my context, I would like to very quickly add in a minute or two what we currently see along peace building. And in fact, in Copenhagen and in most of the spaces where these conversations take place, I noticed that the peace building actors are not there. Like in Copenhagen, I noticed that we had a lot of humanitarian actors, a few development actors, and no peace building actors at all. So If you want to address that in a nexus, then you have to ensure that all the actors are on the table. And again, the approaches. Currently in Nigeria, because it's an insurgency conflict, we have a peace building project led by the UN and the international community where, in the name of reintegration, we're bringing ex-combatants into communities without consulting communities, without working with communities. Somehow communities now feel that we're trying to reward bad behavior by incentivizing even being a terrorist. You give them skills, you give them, stipends, while people who have suffered from their atrocities are struggling to put food on the tables of their family. And I think the challenge there is that from the beginning, local actors were not consulted, communities were not put in the center of that response, and then it ended up, like we said, doing more harm than good.
Thank you. No, I think that's a really important point. And
work that we do around the nexus is prioritize girls in the heart and center of our responses. So thank you, and over.
Great, I think your video got cut off just for a second there, but no, thank you so much. I think that we found.
Oh dear, so sorry.
I think that we found some of the same things, in that only 2 evaluations even mention community engagement in nexus approaches. So, are communities being engaged? Are they saying what's needed in their community? A lot of peace building is also local. I don't know very much about Nigeria. I worked in South Sudan, and I can tell you there were lots of local grievances being spilled over. So I think it was surprising to me how little community-centered views were in terms of articulating what the agenda is. In terms of peace actors, I think maybe ALNAP, we need to have a separate call on the nexus with as many peace actors as possible, inviting all of the peace side and just talking about peace, because I would really love to unpack that. So maybe that would be a follow-up conversation, I think, to have, really diving only into the peace agenda. So I want to just now, we only have a few minutes, unfortunately. I've been skimming through a lot of the different questions. Most of them are not posed to specific panelists. There were a few, however, to Michael of ECHO, working with the Grand Bargain. And so I do want to, because you were our first speaker, I want to go back to you first. And I just want to ask, the Grand Bargain has been looking at localization. ALNAP, we've done other events saying there hasn't been a lot of progress on localization, to be honest, in terms of really shifting kind of decision making. And definitely we've seen that in terms of shifting funding. And so also the Grand Bargain now is taking on work on the nexus. Can you say concretely what you think maybe would be the agenda going forward? Where can the Grand Bargain add value? What is the added value, and how are you going to engage maybe with local actors in terms of taking forward your work on the HDP Nexus as well? So Michael, if you're still here, over to you.
Sure, absolutely, Susanna. Very interesting discussion. Thanks to all the panelists. In a way, I already replied in anticipation to your question. I mean, there are a couple of things on the agenda of the Grand Bargain, like improving the self-reporting, like disseminating better cases of best practice, like, for example, the Global Alliance on Food Security, which is a good example in that regard. Or we have in Somalia, for example, the Dan-Wadak Consortium and so forth. We have in DRC, good cooperation between the ICRC and the World Bank. So we can do that. And we can of course look more into the reasons why all the things that you found so correctly are not working. But ultimately, and I think that's also true to for the question of localization, ultimately the question is, do we simply want to repair the system as it stands right now and make it a little bit more fit for purpose, or do we want to go further and perhaps think of a more systemic overhaul? Now, what I found very interesting is that in your report's finding number 9, you say that the long-standing concerns that the nexus could basically compromise the humanitarian principles, but for that there's absolutely no evidence. And here at ECHO we have exactly the same experience. For 3 years now, we are associating systematically our programming exercises. We are associating our development and our foreign policy colleagues to our programming exercises. And I remember extremely well the fears of colleagues who started in 2020. Listen, we are opening the gates to hell. If that happens, and people like Erdogan would come in, basically forces compromise and neutrality and so forth. Now, this is absolutely not the case. Sorry, this is to be a little bit of a problem video. I hope you can still hear me.
We can hear you. You've been cutting out just a little bit. You're a bit clearer now.
Okay, great. Sorry, the video doesn't seem to work, but you hear me. Now, so what did not happen since we associated other policy areas to our programming is any kind of unfriendly takeover, any kind of compromising. And I think that should encourage us, because that's also your finding. Now, if that is so, then I think we should be more courageous than just try to establish better bridges between the individual sectors. We should think, what does it take to focus more on affected people? And, you know, some donors, and I'm afraid that even if we have a very much, we want to go for a very much local and, let's say, local beneficiary-centered approach, but at the end of the day, as long as the money comes from donors, the donors will have a very decisive word in this. You know? So some donors will find it easy to basically merge their humanitarian, their development, and maybe even parts of their climate work. If you're a small donor, then, or let's say a relatively small administration, then this is easy. It will be difficult for the United States, for Germany, for the European Union, and the like. So for us, I think we have to reflect whether we simply want to go for the establishment of specific financial instruments that look both at the humanitarian and the development part. The peace-building part is much more complex. I would perhaps at this stage leave that out a little bit. But if we already bring together at least the dual nexus and then come with some kind of cross-cutting priorities like gender, like environment, I think we can at least, allow me the term, kill some of the birds that we are discussing here. The next question is whether at some point we should go for, let's say, institutional reform. For example, if the trend is confirmed that despite the efforts of the World Bank under its new president, more and more development donors are in reality leaving fragile country situations. And I think the ODA figures seem to indicate this for the time being. So if development cooperation large, goes more in the direction of
Okay, I'm sorry. I think we're losing you. Sorry, I can't hear what you're saying. Is it okay that we stop there for a second, just because the sound is cutting off? And I think that we are also at time, unfortunately. But I want to go in one word to Cyprian, to put you on the spot, Cyprian, because the OECD is often seen as the promoter of the nexus, of the one putting the nexus out there. And there was just one question on how worrisome it is that conflict sensitivity and do no harm is so rare. Is the OECD going to do more advocacy and really make it clear that do no harm is essential and you cannot do the nexus without doing any harm? You know, I just, yeah, in one word, is that, and localization, are you going to integrate? Are those things that you feel willing to take on? Or is that kind of a conversation that you feel needs to kind of keep happening in other spaces? Yeah, so just one word from you, and then that'll be our last word from the panel, and we'll wrap.
Thank you. And of course not. It has to be, the conversation has to take place in many other forums, but into the text of the DAC recommendation, the push for do no harm in the terms of conflict sensitivity is quite clear. It's all about conflict prevention. It's all about supporting conflict prevention, and really it's quite clear. And same for locally led. There is a full provision on that. And it's part of the fundamental change. I talked about the way we look at crisis, but the change in the way we look at crisis, of course, gives all the leading power of localization to the fore. And localization is not only about transferring money from donors' pockets to local actors' pockets and not to international actors' pockets. It's about really who decides. So it's not only transactional, it's about who decides what is to be done. So this is more fundamental shift, and it's long and complicated, but there is a lot to be done. Our report is starting, will be launched on the 5th of April. So more is to come. Thank you.
Great. So we're going to stay tuned for that. And I think this conversation, we could probably go on for another half hour, but we are 3 minutes over time. We're going to end it right there. If we can just put the final slide up for those of you who are still with us. So this is just around how you can stay engaged with ALNAP. So obviously, we welcome you to download our paper. You can see the QR code there. You can also just go to ALNAP's website, HDP Nexus. You'll find our paper. You'll also find another video. You're going to find a Nexus briefing as well. We have a wider learning series looking at humanitarian sticking points, including, in addition to the Nexus localization and accountability to affected populations. We had a great event a few days ago on that. And ALNAP is also doing ongoing work. We're working with the Interagency Standing Committee Nexus Task Force on a mapping of HDP Nexus good practices with a particular focus on peace, localization, and impacts. And this will be released in 2024. And my colleague Jen Doherty and May, another one of my colleagues, are working on that. So please, follow us on social media, sign up to our newsletter, and get in contact with us. And I hope that you enjoyed the event today. It was a snapshot of what could be a very long conversation, I think, that needs to be happening in terms of really now looking where are we not making progress, why, what are we going to do differently to make sure that it is affected people that are at the center of the approaches in so many of these contexts. So I want to thank all of our panelists today and thank the audience members for being with us. And have a good rest of your day, afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are. Thank you.